Hello, I'm Peter and this is the Scottish Flute channel, the channel for all things traditional flute and whistle playing in Scotland. Now today we have an interview that was carried out during the recent Flute Fling event in Aberdeen, and it was actually carried out by Dougie Pincock, and he was interviewing Munro Gauld as part of that event. So many thanks to Dougie and to Flute Fling, in particular Gordon Turnbull, for agreeing to allow me to show this video. So Munro, if you don't know him, has been carrying out some very interesting research into traditional music in Scotland, and he's also a very accomplished flute player. So sit back, buckle up and enjoy the show. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you very much indeed, Gordon, for that, and Peter for that lovely welcome. Hello to everybody here at the Flute Fling in Aberdeen in November 2023, and hello to all of you out there in YouTube land watching Peter's channel. Thanks for your support. I'm sitting today with Munro Gauld here, and I've known Munro for not a continuous period of time, but some little period of some just under 20 years when I moved up to Plockton to do the job that I've just finished doing. Munro was living up there and we played lots of tunes together in the Plockton Inn, and at that time Munro was working for the Community Land Unit, and that's kind of got some direct relevance, I think, to what we're going to talk about today, because Munro is now, I've just discovered, a full-time musical researcher. I think he's to be congratulated on that. And a lot of what he has to say is to do with music and its connections to places and place. In fact, we've just been in, those of us who were in Munro's workshop there will realise that a lot of the music that he was dealing with in that place, in that workshop, was connected to geographical locations and the history attached there too. So that's, I think, going to be the sort of general theme of our ramblings. What is the music of place? Is there such a thing as music of place?
I don't think there's a formal definition of it, but logic dictates it is the music that has grown out of that place over time. So it's not necessarily music that's been written about a place, but it's more music that's welled up from that place itself. And typically in Scotland that would be, from our point of view as melody tune musicians, there's lots of fiddle music, there's pipe music, later on there's dance band music, but there's also an undercurrent of an overlapping current as well of song, and that's Scots song and Gaelic song. If you're in the Gauld in the Highlands, then yeah, they're the things which all contribute to the music of place.
And why does that matter? Why should we give a hoot?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and sometimes I don't think you should. Because if you're playing a session, if you're playing like last night, it doesn't make any difference. You're playing tunes with your mates, your friends, or playing in the pub or whatever. You just play the tunes, and you enjoy the tunes that you know and you can share with other people. That's what it's about. And where they come from is perhaps not as important as the joy of playing with each other. However, I think there is a place for recognising the music that pertains to a particular place, and for a lot of us it's the place that we're from, whether we're born there or we come to choose to live in a place. There's definitely a connection between where we are hefted to and the music that came out of that area, and I think that the music can help inform our understanding of the past, of the people who lived there before, the events that took place, the history, the folklore, all the things that pertain to that place. And we can understand that place better through music. And music is a wonderful medium. We'll come along later to a project I did in Glenmoriston, but we did a project there and still are doing a project which we did under 3 years. And the project was run by a woman who has done educational projects for environmental organisations, for cultural organisations, for all her adult life. She's retired, but she's done 40 years of it. And she said the music project affected the people that were involved in the project, the audience, the people who participated, the people in the Glen, more than any other project she'd ever done in her whole working life. Because I think music connects emotionally with you, and we all know the songs that we grew up, with when we were 13 and 14, but also the music that's connected to place has an emotional attachment to us, and we to those tunes as well, and the music of that place. So I think there is a place for it, but it's not universal. And in a session, if you before you played a tune had to give the introduction and a soliloquy of 5 minutes about where this tune was, come from and the story behind it, nobody's interested. Just play the tune and enjoy it.
But there's clearly something in this, because any student, I suppose any traditional music really, we'll talk about Scotland, just by looking at the titles of the tunes, would see immediately how important places are. Leaving Glenarchart, the Hills of Perth, the Rothy Marcus Rant, all these things that are connected to places. So clearly, just at a very superficial level, the titles of the tunes themselves will give you some kind of idea that they're connected to some locality. How about the actual, rather than just looking at the titles, if we dip in below that a wee bit, have you found in the course of your researches that there's a way to hear a tune and tell where it's from? Not down to the exact postcode, perhaps. But
personally, no, I don't think there is. Although we're talking in our class just there about a whole lot of tunes that are strathspeys, which are kind of lyrical rolling strathspeys that we did. One of them, Coig na Scalan, which is from Strathdern. And looking at that recently, over the last 6 months, a year, I realised there's tunes of that type, the similar, usually 4-part strathspey reels, which blur the boundary between what is a strathspey and what is a reel. They all seem to come from a particular area from a particular time, that mid-1700s, and that Central Highlands area between, Glengarry and Deeside, that whole stretch of Scotland over there. And there's a feeling about those tunes which is quite similar, that I think, those tunes come from there. But then, if you're looking wider at song, and Gaelic song, there's definitely regional variations in terms of song, much more so than tunes.
Well, it's going to be linguistic, dialect variations, I suppose, nowadays,
Although a lot of the Gaelic songs have moved, they've maybe written about one specific geographic area, but are sung in completely another. There's songs from Perthshire that I've heard recordings of from people in the Western Isles, singing. And there's the song that used to be sung, I'm sure maybe still is sung in the Plockton Inn, Grigol Here, Beloved Gregor, which comes from Perthshire, comes from a place very close to where I've been doing quite a lot of work at the Cranach Centre. If you know the Cranach Centre in Lochte, they asked us to do a whole series of performances over a year. They had a music project for a year, and the fire festivals of Beltane and Samhain, and we were doing performances in the Cranach before it burnt down for 30 people. And they asked us to play some music. So it'd be 30 people, and then we'd have a 5-minute break, and then another 30 would come in. And then so we'd do 4 of these performances a night, and we did half a dozen of them throughout the year. And it just made sense for us, rather than play generic Scottish traditional music, to play music that pertained to either that festival itself or the place. And Grigol Hria, Beloved Gregor, was written in 1570 by the wife Marion Campbell of Gregor MacGregor of Glenstray, who was beheaded by the Colin Campbell, the Earl who became the Earl of Breadalbane, and then later the Marquesses of Breadalbane, the ones who did who were connected to the massacre in Glencoe. They don't have a good rep.
It's got a bad rap.
Well, and it's not entirely, from reading the history, it's not entirely wrong. But anyway, when you stood on the Cranach, you could see the hill, Tomnacroich, where he was executed in 1570, and the song is all about his wife, being wretched. She was present at his death when Colin Campbell beheaded her husband. And she was from a Campbell. She was a Campbell herself, and was related to Colin Campbell, who beheaded her husband. And she had her baby in her arms, and she was pregnant with her second child of the Gregor MacGregor. And it's just the grief she has comes through after how many hundreds of years. You feel the grief that she had, and she takes a cup and she takes some of his blood and she drinks his blood, so that part of him could stay with her, you know. And yeah, why would you not play that in sight of the place where you're playing? That's because there's a huge direct connection, you know.
And how would you feel as you were singing it? It'll have a material effect on the performance of that piece of music. There's a very direct connection between the music and the place right there.
Yeah, and there's, you know, and once people know the story about it, there's a, you know, people understand and connect to that piece of music much, much more when they realise the backstory and how we're just, yeah, it's just that slip of time that separates us from those events that happened a long time ago. So when I was doing the Carnick things, I went like, wow, are there any other tunes really local to you? And, you know, I quickly found out there's quite a few. You know, there's 3 fiddler composers who came from Kenmore, which is a quarter of a mile away, in the golden age of fiddling in the latter part of the 18th century. Duncan McKercher, Angus McLaren and Donald MacDonald, they all came from, just within half a mile of where the Cranach Centre is. And they all published works of fiddle music. And if ever you are on Tober and Dolchus, everybody has ever seen that. That's a website which is, it's an oral history and folklore and music website, which is a partnership between the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh and the BBC and the National Trust. There may be other partners as well.
Solmore partner?
Solmore, they actually, because they're involved in administering it as well. And that's a great resource. And keying in local, you can interrogate it and finding, so I found a Gaelic song which had been written by a chap, Christy MacDonald, who lived less than a mile away from the Cranach, and he wrote it in the 1960s, bemoaning the fact that here he was in his house at Lagan, and when he was growing up, he was surrounded by Gaelic speakers, and now there was just him. And that's a lovely connection to the past. I think my view is that pretty much anywhere in Scotland, if you stick your pin in the map and you start digging, you'll find a musical history. And that music helps inform your understanding and appreciation of that place.
Well, certainly in all the time I've been involved in music education, we always try to make sure that the people learning it also have some knowledge of that context, but it's quite hard to get into them when they're just busy learning tunes, but it really does make a difference, I think. Well, we're going to talk a wee bit about some of you give us some examples of the research projects that you've done in a few minutes, but I'm wondering, and I guess maybe a lot of the people in the audience might wonder as well, what's the starting point for you of this? How did you get started in this stuff? What lit the flame?
It was, I was interested in Schiehallion, the hill, Schiehallion. It's got a fascinating story, and the name Schiehallion is the hill of the Caledonians. The Callion is the Caledonian part of it, and the hill, the she part, is, like you have Sheehan fairy mounds and hills. So it's Schiehallion is usually translated as the fairy hill of the Caledonians. But the fairy concept is a concept which was brought in with the Gaels. And the Caledonians were, that was at the time of the Picts and earlier. So they predate the belief in fairies that the Gaels brought from Ireland. So in my head, it's more like the spirit mountain of the Caledonians, because they were animists, they weren't Christian. So they believed everything had a spirit. And mountains and rivers, and they all had spirits which they paid homage to. They didn't necessarily worship, but they believed they had a spirit life. There was a physical life and a spiritual life, and those two were quite closely tied in. And Schiehallion is an interesting place, because it's one of the only places that the Caledonian name, the name of the local tribe, is remembered. And for those of you who know Schiehallion, it's like an iconic shape. It's kind of like a pointed shark fin. And Muriel Gray used to joke in the Munro show when she did on TV was that wherever you are in Scotland, you could always see Schiehallion, because it's that one in the distance over there, because it looks, so it's really distinctive. And for lots of people, it's got a really emotional connection for some reason. So I got involved with that because I was speaking to the John Muir Trust, who owned Schiehallion, and they were developing an arts project. So I became involved in an arts project relating to Schiehallion. And there's people who can think back to their physics school.
That's what I remember. I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Where the masculine, the astronomer royal, worked out the mass of the world based upon the volume of the hill Schiehallion, because it's geometrical, you can work out its volume. And he built wee huts up halfway up the hill and had a pendulum, and the pendulum, how much it was attracted towards the hill, determined the mass of the hill, and you could then calculate the mass of the world. And he wasn't that far wrong. But they were having an arts project of that, and as part of the story of that, when he was busy doing his experiment one summer, and it was 17, it was the same, yeah, it was 17, when was it? Yeah, 1784, I'm thinking right.
So you're worth that.
Yeah, he was, they had a local guy who ferried things up for them, you know, coal and firewood and whatnot to keep them, and provisions, and yeah, and he also played the fiddle. So he played the fiddle tunes for them, and the last night they were there, he took a keg of whiskey up with him, and they all got absolutely blazing through, everybody, the astronomer royal, everybody, and Duncan. He got absolutely, and they set fire to the cabin, and everything got burnt down.
Deliberately?
No, they were just, they were well away. So, and his fiddle got burned.
Oh, no.
So when Maslin went back to London, he bought an Italian fiddle, violin, and sent it to Duncan back in Highland, Perthshire. And he had this. Some people said it was a Stradivarius, but it was and he was a musician. He wrote a song about it, and he, all to this yellow London lady, he called it. So that was my kind of starting point, was being interested in that story and trying to I found the words to the song, but I couldn't find the melody. The melody had been lost, so it was like an orphaned song. But then they asked us, they wanted to recreate that night without the whiskey. Well, we didn't get a keg of whiskey, but so we recreated the night that the hut burnt down, and they had a yurt which they put up on the side of Schiehallion, and we played some music relating to that event. So the question is like, what are you going to play? So you'd have to play something that he would play in in the latter part of the 18th century. So yeah, that opens the question of what you play. Yeah, so that's kind of got me questioning and searching and finding local, and I mean really local, not Perthshire. I wanted to find tunes that he would have known and played on that hill on that evening. Then we recreated that on the hill, which was okay.
We'll talk a wee bit more about the. I am very interested in how of you answered that question. You know, what would you play? Go and find the tune, and I hope we'll have a bit of time for discussion on that. But there's a couple of examples that you've got with you of research projects that you've been recently working on. Would you want to tell me a bit about some of them?
Yeah. Well, I'll just finish off a wee bit of the Schiehallion story, because one of the things I discovered, was that just, once you start digging and pulling threads, you come up with all sorts of lovely things. And I discovered a fantastic, it was a poem in an 1804 book of Gaelic poems and songs about a woman who had, the woman was Euphemia Reid, who had a life rent of a croft, a wee small farm on the north side of Schiehallion, and she went in September with three of her youngest children. She had 8 children, and she took her 3 youngest children to the Shieling on the south side of Schiehallion in Glenmore, to the Shieling there just for a holiday. There was all the rest of the people who go to the Shielings had gone home, and when she was there, her 3 children caught fever, and 3 of them perished, and they died in the Shieling in the south side of Schiehallion. So I found this poem, and it had a thing at the top saying "Air Fond," which in Gaelic means "sung to the tune of," which allowed me to identify the tune that it was sung to. And then it's a lovely thing to be able to, working with Gaelic singers, to get an orphaned song, an orphaned kind of poem, and put the melody to it and reunite it. And it's just the most beautiful words. It was translated in the early 1800s by Anne Grant of Laggan, but she made it rhyme. And I was like, Yeah, and it kind of was the diddly diddly dum, the diddly diddly dum, the diddly diddly dum, and they all died. Terrible. And it was all rhymed, and it was like, no, there's got to be a better version of this. So yeah, and it's just a beautiful tune. So, and it turns out it's in 7/8 time, which is tasty. An unusual tasty. Yeah. But as I'm told, even though it's in 7/8 time when it was sung, it wouldn't have been in any time.
It would be very free.
It would have been just sung, and whatever time signature it was sung in, they wouldn't be aware of it. And so it's lovely to be able to put those songs relating to a specific place. And I've been in contact with the descendants of the landowners at the time who have got all the title deeds and estate records to identify the specific shieling hut on the south side of Schiehallion where that happened. And this is why I think it's important, because that immediately resonates with you. If you're the John Muir Trust and you own that piece of land, that wee ruckle of stones is no longer just a wee ruckle of stones of shieling. This is where her 3 children, including her youngest Ian, who played the fiddle, that's where they all died. And it's just a lovely thing to be able to put them all together. And it's a precious wee thing.
Is that what drives you to keep going with these things?
It's a bit like archaeology. You're uncovering history and then uncovering little clues and then putting the clues together to put together history. There's a quote, and I just wanted to read it from it. Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall. She's a historical novelist, but she's hugely respected, not just by novelists but by historians too, because she was able to unlock a lot of things relating to Tudor history particularly that historians weren't able to do, because she was able to imagine why circumstances happened given the facts that were known. And historians look at specific facts and write history based upon known facts, and she took those known facts and went, yeah, that doesn't feel right, why did that happen? And then managed to get inside Cromwell's head and that whole period. But I did the Reith lecture, the BBC Reith lecture, 2017, something about there, and she said, St. Augustine says, the dead are invisible, they're not absent. You needn't believe in ghosts to see that that's true. We carry the genes and the culture of our ancestors, and what we think about them shapes what we think about ourselves and how we make sense of our time and place. Are these good times, are they bad times, or are they interesting times? We rely on history to tell us. History and science help us to put our small lives in a context. But if we want to meet the dead looking alive, we must turn to art. And I think music gives us a chance to bring back Euphemia Reid and her children, her life experience in Schiehallion. By re-singing that song, we transport ourselves back to that time, and we can feel what it's like and her emotions at that time. So that's a precious, lovely thing.
I think it's probably true of most art forms, but it's certainly something that we as traditional musicians have got a really direct connection to, because we play old music.
Yeah.
And hopefully we know where it's come from a lot of the time.
And a lot of that music is, even though it's learned music sometimes from dots or whatnot, it's part of a continuing tradition. It's not an academic exercise. It's, as musicians, we're still feeling the music today and inheriting that tradition of feeling the music that's been there since way back. And you can go back as far as you like, even to the Iron Age. You could pause it.
Oh yeah?
We might come back to it.
That would be nice. Tell us a little bit about this project. You've mentioned a couple of times in our discussions leading up to this about the Glen Morriston project, which really strikes a chord with me. Yeah,
I was lucky to be asked by a woman who lives in Glen Morriston, or did at the time, to help look into the musical story of Glen Morriston, because it's all about a story, telling a story really.
Can I maybe just for the people, most of the people here will probably know where Glen Morriston is, but in YouTube world, Glen Morriston's kind of in the centre of the Highlands on the way. I actually drive through Glen Morriston on a very regular basis. And my commute from Octortara to Inverness, so it's in that kind of west central part of the Highlands.
Yeah, it runs off heading westwards, it's off the west side of the bottom of Loch Ness. And Joyce had a book called Story and Song from Loch Ness Side, which had been published in 1914 by Alexander MacDonald, who was a crofter, who was born as a crofter, but he ended up being working in Inverness for the railway company. And all throughout his life, he collected local music, and he published this book in 1914. And there's lots of songs in there, and it had been reprinted in 1982. And in the 1982 edition, there was at the back the music for some of the songs, and they were in solfa notation, which is like do re mi. There's all sorts of squiggles and lines to give length of. To make it readable in terms. And it's used,
the favoured medium of modern Gaelic choirs, actually.
Yeah, it's still used by. Yeah, they still use that. But it was mainly a kind of Victorian up to this. Up to the Second World War, in the 1950s, people would use it to learn how to sing mainly. But it's kind of fallen out of favour a wee bit. So Joyce asked us to decipher that, which was a bit like. As neither a singer or a Gaelic speaker particularly, but I had some known tunes in there, so I could, like the Rosetta Stone, I could go, well, I know what this tune is, therefore I can work out how it all works, and then it's mechanical. So it was nice because I was able to put tunes to songs that otherwise become poems. Yeah. And in Gaelic, the world of Gaeldom, almost certainly up to the Victorian times, every poem was a song. There wasn't such a thing as a poem. They were all sung to help people remember. So I was asked to, with Kate Langhorne, who was a singer and Gaelic researcher, to research into the musical history of Glenmoriston. And just as soon as we got given the contract, lockdown happened. Oh. So it became a desk exercise. But even as a desk exercise, we actually uncovered just the most amazing heritage of Gaelic song. And in that one exercise, we uncovered, this is our scoping exercise, which, because Kate and I were both at home, twiddling our thumbs, instead of becoming like a 20-page scoping exercise, we just went, well, let's just roll our sleeves up and get on with it, And so it became 100-page, and we discovered 300 songs that were from Glenmoriston or were sung there, which is just an incredibly rich resource.
Well, it is, again, if people don't really know, it's not that big a lump of land. It isn't a huge area.
It's not one of the major glens in Scotland.
Absolutely
no. Not. You drive through it and you wouldn't necessarily, but it's really incredibly rich. And a lot of that is due to Alexander MacDonald, who wrote the book, because he wrote down all the songs he heard. And he also put them in solfa notation, and he published them not just in that book, but all for 30 years, from 1890s until he died in 1928. He published almost every week a song in one of the Inverness papers. So that's just an incredible resource. Yeah. And so after we'd done the report, the community in lockdown finished, the community asked us to come up and report, and we thought we'd do a talk, and there's a graph here, and
get the PowerPoint up there.
Yeah, exactly. And we thought, well, actually, that is, as saying earlier, that's dancing about architecture. If there's all these songs, and there's mainly songs, there were some tunes, but their heritage is Gaelic song, really. The best way of doing that is to sing the songs. And that was brilliant, because we knew that some of these songs had not been sung for at least 100 years in the Glen. And we wanted to invoke Kate's Ballachulish, and I live just north of Perth, and a friend Neil, who I play music with, lives in Aberfeldy. We wanted to involve a local person as well, a local musician. So we worked with Charlie Gray, who's one of your former pupils.
I know Charlie very well, yes.
Who is a beautiful fiddler, an absolutely beautiful fiddler, and he plays lots of Gaelic airs on the fiddle. And
again, possibly worth pointing out for people that wouldn't be in the know that Charlie is the grandson of Ishbel McCaskill, the great Gaelic singer.
And Charlie
has his own heritage.
Yeah, but Charlie always assumed that Gaelic were related to his Ishbel McCaskill. That's in his head. He didn't think this was. He was from Fort Augustus.
She was from Lewis, so there's a fair distance there. So
yeah, but in his head, Gaelic song was from Lewis. Yeah, and what he said, he didn't realise that actually where he grew up, he was absolutely surrounded by Gaelic song, and he said, this changed completely the way he thought about music, because he realised the huge heritage Duchas in Gaelic is that kind of rootedness and connection to place that these tunes represented. So that was a lovely thing to do. So we had a few concerts in the Glen, and that was an amazing experience for everybody. All the people in the Glen who came to see it, and us who were sharing the music with them. Some of the songs had not been sung for hundreds of years, and Kate and I worked to find the tunes for a lot of these tunes, for these songs. They're orphaned, I will think of them as orphaned songs, so they've lost their melody, but finding the melody that applied to them. And it was a lovely thing. It was just a beautiful thing, and it was quite emotional for everybody in the Glen, and it was very emotional for us playing the music, because it was just hefted to that place.
Without getting into a heavy-duty political discussion, obviously the demographic, the population in the Highlands of Scotland has changed a lot in the last few years, and there's a lot of incoming people. Did you find that there were still enough locals in the area that had some kind of folk memory of any of this stuff?
Yeah, there's a handful of families still from Glenmoriston, including one family who's still Gaelic speakers in the Glen, who have that direct connection back to the past. But reading Alexander MacDonald's one of his articles, it said, and he was writing this in the mid-1890s, he was saying there's scarcely a single person in this Glen who's not related to the ancient bards of this Glen. In 1895, everybody was a Gaelic speaker in Glenmoriston, and everybody was related to way back, to Culloden before that. And the songs that we found describe the arc of history, basically.
That's what I was going to ask you. What kind of subject matter did you find that these songs were covering? Was there any different from what we would expect?
Well, they were all local songs. There wasn't anything about international events.
Of the world.
No, apart from one Alistair MacIan Vane, who had fought in the Peninsular Campaign in the Napoleonic Wars, and he wrote songs about his experience of being in the war, and they weren't the normal Gaelic songs of us lads, we bravely fought, and yes, we showed them what for. His songs were like, don't ever become a soldier and see the things that I've seen and have to do the things I've had to do. Yeah, so his songs are very remarkable in that regard. But there's also songs. Scottish Natural Heritage, Nature Scot, funded the research because the songs charted the changing land use over the period from 1700 to 1900. And so there's lots of songs, old songs about shillings, about cattle droving, about all those aspects of traditional land management. And then there's some songs relating to the coming of the sheep and the clearances. And then they're all folk songs. They're all sure. Songs written by local people about local events. And then there's songs about the coming of the sporting estates in 1840. And we found one song which is Oran na Gamerin, the song of the gamekeeper, which is a local person going, wow, all these people are coming in, with their fancy tweeds and their boots and their thin dogs and their muskets, and lording it over us and telling we've got to keep quiet, we're not allowed to graze our cows in the hill, and if I bloody met them in the hill, I'd give them all. I'd be the one with the fancy boots and shoes and things, which is really that kind of, it's like oral history from 1840, and being able to hear his voice through this song and his displeasure at the changing in land management and land ownership practices. So that's kind of amazing.
So that's something now that's just, sorry about this, but I'm going to spring this on you. This just occurred to me as you were talking there that I have rather foolishly been looking at this discussion only for the point of view of us as musicians. But clearly this work that you do and the stuff that the Nature Scot are putting up money for it, so it must matter to them. Clearly it matters every bit as much to them as historians and land use people as it does to us as musicians. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think good on Nature Scot for realising that in order for people to engage with the debate of changing land use and land management, which is always going on in terms of the Highlands of Scotland, then you have to engage with people in a cultural way, and through music it's a great way of engaging other people who would maybe not necessarily normally want to engage in the subject. And that's why working with the John Muir Trust was good as well, because they're recognising there's a cultural importance as well as an environmental significance in their ownership of estates in Scotland.
We actually did an album for the John Muir Trust at Blockton, can't remember, about 10 years ago or something like that, but it was their idea. It was they came to us and it was their commission, and they got the kids to write songs about different places that they own, so that was a definite symbiosis.
Yeah, and it's just rich, because as I said earlier, you know, the people connect through music, through song and through tunes in a way that is very different from any other way. And you can write academic reports like this and lists and blah blah, but actually if you playing the tunes and singing the songs, there's nothing quite like it. Yeah. And in terms of we came across not many tunes from Glenmoriston. It's mainly a kind of song tradition. Yet other areas have huge fiddle traditions or piping traditions, and it's just every area is slightly different. But one of the tunes, I don't know if you've ever heard Arran and Batten, the shilling of the brushwood and thicket. And in the back of the Simon Fraser collection, there's a wee note about it and said this song originates in the Highlands, high areas of Glenmoriston, between the Glen and the Glen to the south, owned by Fraser Kilduffel, and it's about a shilling in a disputed area of ground. And I thought, well, that's worth exploring, because most of the shillings in Glenmoriston don't have a name. You know, they're just abandoned shillings, and people spent their summers there for hundreds of years, but they're not identified anywhere else. They're not identified in the maps as anything other than ruins or shillings or whatever in the OS surveys. So I thought, here's a really nice chance to put a name to an individual shilling. So the kind of investigative work, really, it's a bit like what Coralie does, but relating to tunes, is to find out where that shilling would have been. And the National Map Library has all the estate maps of the Lovets. And if you go back there in the early part of the 18th century, there's a land dispute between them, and the lawyers had drawn up a map of the disputed area and went, brilliant. That narrows it down. We've got that small area, that there's 100 acres or whatever. It's got to be in there somewhere. And then looking at aerial photographs and Historic Environment Scotland's records, we identified where it might be. And Joyce and her husband Doug spent one Sunday afternoon traipsing over the hills with their GPS and found where Arran and Batten was. Yeah, and that's lovely, just because then you play that tune and it's hefted to that pile of stones. And that's special. So it's,
Were there any other particular projects that you wanted to mention, apart from the Glenmoriston one?
I've been involved in quite a few. There's another project I'm involved in just now is related to my own area, because this whole subject is like an area, it's called ethnomusicology, and lots of people study it for 4 years or whatnot, and one of the precepts of that is that you should dig where you stand. You should research the tunes from where you are, rather than, anthropologists would go to, tribes in Africa or whatever like that and study them, but actually from an ethnomusicology point of view, you should examine your own heritage where you are, where you've lived. So I thought, time for me to do that.
Practice what you preach.
Practice what I preach and do my own. I've lived just close to Dunkeld, so I was researching a wee project from my own interest mainly about a family who lived in Dunkeld who were related to the owners of Schiehallion, because all Perthshire landowners from the 18th, 19th century were all intermarried, and so there's lots of. And they've got a hugely interesting story of themselves, but it took me into the Dunkeld Community Archive where I uncovered some fiddle music which was written by James Mackintosh. And James Mackintosh was born in 1846 and died in 1937.
Is this here of the Mackintosh collections? Is this the same
No,
guy?
it's a different. That's Red Rob Mackintosh, who was from Tillymet. The Mackintosh family, the fiddlers that is related to, all came from Edinburgh. In fact, the original Charles Mackintosh, who first arrived in 1780, was the neighbour of Neil Gow.
Okay.
And he was obviously musical. He became the presenter at the Free Church. Well, it wasn't the Free Church then, but he became presenter at the Church of Scotland in Dunkeld. And his sons he educated musically through Neil Gow. So James Mackintosh's uncle was the last of Neil Gow's pupils, and he became a professional fiddler and moved to Edinburgh. His brother stayed in Dunkeld, and he also became a professional fiddler. And they was a family dynasty that went right up to 1988. Elizabeth Mackintosh passed away in 1988, and for that 200 years, that family were local fiddlers.
Pretty much unbroken.
Yeah, unbroken. And James Mackintosh, his brother is quite well known, Charles Mackintosh, because he was a naturalist and was a friend of Beatrix Potter. So he became moderately famous, but he played the cello. But his brother James, born in 1946, played the fiddle and inherited his father's dance band and played music all his life until he was a very elderly man. And in his 80s he set up the Dunkeld Strathspey Reel, which is still going today. And so today's Dunkeld Strathspey Reel Society has got a direct link all the way back to Neil Gow through an unbroken continuous tradition. And that's lovely. So to come across in the Dunkeld Community Archives some unpublished work written by James Mackintosh is just wonderful.
Dust.
It's gold dust. So I'm working with them to publish the music and publish the music of all the rest of the family, because they all wrote music, and some of the music is published in various fiddle collections, but others is held in private collections in Athol, Blair Athol Castle, and at Moncrief House, south of Perth, and they've never been published. So pulling all that family's music together and telling the story of that family is a lovely thing to do. So that's what we're going to be doing next year, telling the story of Charles, the original Charles, who delightfully arrived in 1780 in Dunkeld in Edinburgh to become Neil Gow's neighbour, dressed as a woman.
That is absolutely delightful.
A cross-dressing, it starts off. That's just he dressed as a woman to flee the press gang of the East India Company.
Wow.
The Duke of Athol had raised the Athol Highlanders as a regiment, and he had tried to sell the Athol Highlanders regiment after the end of the American War of Independence to the East India Company, and the Athol Highlanders had mutinied, and the House of Commons found in their favour because they was breaking the terms of their enlistment, and they were marched back up to Coldstream and disbanded. But after that, the East India Company, having not got their army that he was promised by the Duke of Athol, they went down Glentilde, press ganging people to join their army, even though they had no legal right to do that whatsoever. That's what they did. So that's why Charles Mackintosh fled to Edinburgh dressed as a woman.
Good press gang.
It's a great story.
It is a great story, and it refers to another unbroken tradition, because the Athol Highlanders still exists.
Yeah.
It still exists as the only private army in Europe, certainly in the United Kingdom anyway, and has featured fairly recently some very, very fine pipers, including the late great Gordon Duncan, who's remembered the Athol Highlanders. You said a very interesting thing in your workshop about Dunkeld, speaking particularly about Dunkeld, when we got talking about different styles of Scottish music and how there's an influence from Europe, from France and Italy coming up through Edinburgh on the eastern side, but also then there's the Irish, the Celtic influence on the west. And we were talking about that, and you said that there was something really important that happened at the interface of these places. You made an ecological allusion as well about what happens when, because musicians are itinerant, music, you've mentioned that songs travel and singers travel, musicians, and you said that at the interface is often the busiest and most populated part of the ecology. Is that something?
Yeah, well the question is why Dunkeld's got this unbroken tradition of traditional music, probably more than fiddle music in particular, more than anywhere else in Scotland. And there are so many fiddler composers who have come from Dunkeld, and it's been a massively rich tradition. Literally thousands of tunes will have been written by fiddlers from Dunkeld. and the immediate area, Inver and the immediate area around. So the question was like, why did that happen in Dunkeld? Why didn't it happen, anywhere else? So I was cycling along, Dunkeld's in the Highland fault line, cycling along with a friend, Pete, who's an ecologist, and his kind of view as well, where you have two different habitats meeting is where you get the greatest biodiversity, like on Woodland Edge, or with Woodland and Field, or Water's Edge, or shallow water and deep water. That's where you get the greatest biodiversity. And he posited the idea, which I really like, is that Dunkeld is on a cultural boundary between the Highlands and the Lowlands, and it's on the main road north from the Lowlands to the Highlands. So is that why there was such a flowering of the music in Dunkeld area? And because undoubtedly it's hugely rich. There's the eldest daughter of the 7th Duke of Atholl collected tunes, music all her life, and at the end of her life she donated them to Perth Library.
Lady Dorothea?
Lady Dorothea Ruggles Bryce, and she donated her whole collection, and there are 14,000 tunes in the Atholl collection in Perth. That's a lot of tunes.
Where do you start?
Where do you start? Yeah.
Well, where do you start?
Well, I think you start with the places and the things that interest you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you start with, this is where you're from, or you've got
where you start.
the people that you're interested in, or the events that you're interested in. Because for that period from 1760 to 1820, tunes were written about every person, all their children, every house, every hill, burn. Yeah, so it's quite nice because you can interrogate it from the other way and go, right, I'm interested in this family and their story. And you can musically tell the story of family. And that the project I was mentioning relates to the story about the minister from Dunkeld in 1805 to 1824, Alexander Irvine. And he's got an amazing story to tell, him and his wife and all his children, and their the black slave girl who ended up living in Dunkeld in 1822. And that's just a lovely story. You unpick that musically. It tells, and it sheds light on empire in Britain and the slave trade and the sugar trade and how all these things come together musically. So it's really rich.
Wouldn't it be great if she learned the fiddle?
It's sad because she ended up, she was the illegitimate child of the minister's wife's brother, who managed the sugar plantation, the family sugar plantation in Trinidad, and her mother died. She was a freed coloured woman, and when she died, he kind of wanted to, he didn't want to have to look after this child of his, so he brought him home and left her with her sister. Anne Tobin is the girl's name, and it's really nice to be able to tell her story because she spent all of the rest of her life in Highland Perthshire, uncovering where she was buried and seeing her gravestone and being able to tell her whole life story. When for all her life she never married, never had children, she was an oddity, and the rest of the family didn't want her to be identified as family because that would bring shame on them. So she lived kind of a half-life
in the shadows.
Completely. So musically, all the rest of the family had, all of them had fiddle tunes written to them, but Anne Tobin didn't. Yeah. So, that's a nice story to tell, isn't it? And to remember her through music.
We could be here for a long time. We've got a finite amount of time. I want to ask a slightly selfish question here, but although I hope that some other people may be interested in it as well. I'm kind of curious as to know what the mechanics are of how you go about this stuff. Dig where you stand, right? Okay, well, where do you start looking? If I wanted to, I live in Lochalish. If I wanted to start trying to find some songs or tunes that were local to that area, what do I do? Have you any advice for me?
There's every project in every area has its own, to unlock the combination.
Yeah.
And mainly you have to just be thorough and curious and just pull every thread that you find, because every thread is connected to another thread that, you know. So in general, because you live in the Gaeltacht, you're lucky because there's lots of resources. I mentioned Tober and Dulcas, the website. You can put in place names in that in their search facility, and then that will, what often I do when I'm doing that is find the person who donated that story, that song. Then you click on that person, what else did they sing about? But also the Gaelic Society of Inverness has, since the 1880s, produced what they call their transactions, which are papers of research that are done every year by their members. And they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles about culture and history relating to everywhere in the Highlands. And they're fantastic resources, because you can pick whichever area in locales and then find out who the local bards were, because as Anne Grant Lagan said, in every cottage there's a musician, in every hamlet there is a bard. Yeah. So throughout the Highlands there are these bards. It was a hugely culturally literate population throughout that whole period, right up to Victorian times and beyond, where writing songs and poems was an integral part of normal everyday life. And although the Anglophones saw, you know, the Highlanders as barbaric and speaking Erse, and actually they had a hugely rich cultural landscape themselves. So the transactions are a really good source. Gaelic Society of Inverness transactions, but also in terms of tunes, there's lots of databases of tunes, and the way of going in there is there a local musician that's a piper or a fiddler or whatnot, and that usually unlocks, have they published a collection at any time, or were their works published in other collections? Yeah, and as I said, you have to do a wee bit of history. You have to do a lot of digging and reading of history. Books of local history usually have snatches of songs, for instance, of events, because every event that happened of note in the Highlands, somebody would have been commemorated in a song, and a lot of them are still remembered. And there's the whole Victorian time there was a craze for collecting and publishing folklore and songs, and a lot of these were done throughout the whole of the Victorian era. So they're all, the National Library of Scotland is just an amazing resource as well. If you get a reader's card, you have to get your mugshot and prove who you are. You can then go into their special collections and then see all the original manuscripts. And Alexander MacDonald, I found out, when he died, he left all his jottings, every programme, letter, newspaper article he ever wrote, he left to the National Library, and they're all in there. Thousands of bits of paper.
Are they well catalogued? Are they well organised?
No. There's some of them in scrapbooks, but they don't necessarily form logical. But they're there, so you can go and spend in Granite Sandilands, and I and Kate Langhorne, the Gaelic researchers, we spent days in there uncovering tunes and songs, and it's just incredibly rich resource, and it's all there to be found. So how many people have looked at that since his papers were
very few, I would imagine. Even
people who are really in the know in terms of Gaelic song. I spoke to Alan MacDonald about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know Gleanach. He had a pen name, Gleanach, but he also had, I think he had 13 pen names which he wrote in various publications." So he had no idea. He said, "You're joking? No." That's all there, waiting for somebody just to... But it would take a PhD, it would take years of research to... And what made Alexander MacDonald really special is because he noted the songs down, but he noted the tunes down as well. And that's quite rare. Most of them just noted the words of the songs down. And through him you can step back in time. It's just, it's wonderful.
Fabulous. We had a notion, I know we are running a little bit of time, but we had a notion about looking to see if anybody had any questions for Munro from the floor. Has anybody got anything they would like to expand on a little bit? That's piqued your interest?
If not, I could tell you about my work with the Cranach Centre.
Please do.
Yeah, because I did lots of things with the Cranach Centre, doing all these performances. everybody maybe know that the Cranach Centre burnt down, and they're relocating to a new site on the other side of the loch, which they bought. So they said, no, would you, for the opening ceremony and for a museum, would you work together on some music for it? Which is, wow, what a great opportunity that is. Yeah, so I've got together with various musicians and composers and soundy people, and that's what we're working on to do. How do you do music relating to an Iron Age Cranach? Yeah.
What do you know about the music of the Iron Age?
Well, the thing is, it's quite interesting. You'll have come across Dr. John
Purser, the very man I was hoping you would mention him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, he's done lots of research into, although we don't know the music that he played, there's still some of the instruments that they played
sounds,
on. And in one of the Cranachs on Loch Tay, they uncovered one of the oldest bits of musical instruments in Europe, which is the bridge of a lyre. That was found in one of the Cranach sites on Loch Tay, and also a small whistle made out of rosewood, which had been bored out, and so we have those, and I went and measured the instrument and then made a reproduction of it to make, and it makes like a bird call sound. It's a bird call kind of sound thing, but and they had the caranx, which was that the big war horn, and my kind of thesis really in terms of taking forward that bit is that a lot of the work activities that they did in the Iron Age were exactly the same work activities that were carried out 1700 years later. When Dorothy and William Wordsworth travelled down through Loch Tay, they said that everywhere they went, whatever anybody was doing, it was accompanied by song. People sung when they were every activity, milking cows, cutting corn. They were in the autumn, so they were watching people cutting the corn by hand, and they were all singing. He said everything was always accompanied by song. So the flour that was ground on a quern was still the same process as was done in the Iron Age. The milking the cows is the same thing. There's rowing songs from the area from the same time. So all these Gaelic songs from Perthshire, from that immediate locality, have got the same root and the same musical background accompaniment, because it's the rhythm of those work activities which has been carried out. So that's where we're starting from. We're starting from the sound of a cow being hand-milked, the sound of a quern being
used. And rhythm, of course.
And rhythm. And there's no way that you're going to spend an hour opposite somebody on a rotary quern, turning it round and not sing, because it's a mechanical.
It's boring.
It's boring, and you have to do it, I reckon, about an hour a day to feed an extended family. So so there are quern songs from Perthshire. So that's a lovely link back. And traditional music is a music that's learned from, it's inherited music. So it changes over every generation, and we evolve and adapt and add to it. But there's an element, a wee thread of it, which runs back, past generations from us now as traditional musicians to 100 years ago, to 200 years ago. And there's elements that will thread all the way back to the Iron Age. We don't know what they are, but we are here because of people who were there before.
Start to rebuild that connection.
So that's what's going to be the basis of the work with the Cranach Centre, is using local Perthshire work songs and Gaelic songs and the sounds and the instruments that.
When is this expected to come to fruition?
Well, this is in the next 6 months.
Wow.
So it's fun.
Very, very good luck with it, Munro. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much. I'm sure everybody that's in the room out there in YouTube land will think differently and a lot more deeply about the music from this point on. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Munro.
To playing something
we didn't see you do that actually.
Just and now that Pete's put his camera away, and Pete, quick.
No, it's okay.
Just to round off our lovely day.
Well, I remember I mentioned the tune in 7/8 about Schehallien.
You did. That was fascinating.
It's just amazing. You read that. You read the poem, and there's 20 verses or so. The first two, I got my friend to translate from Gauld to English, and it says, now is the time that wounded me, that made me sad to live. My joy and happiness are gone. I shouldn't put my glasses on, sorry. My joy and my happiness are gone. My sun and a mist came over me, and I fell into the black, sad night of oppression. An unkind breeze came, and she took from me my beloved branches. She left me bare on a meadow. Often my tears flow from me, since my loves are in the grave without life. So it's really, that's, wow. It's great. You can feel that.
Yeah.
You feel that after 250 years. You feel
it speaks right across the centuries.
it really
It's a very human emotion, a very, very human response.
Yeah, so William Matheson recorded in the Western Isles a song which was a different song but was the same tune. And that's lovely because, I'm not a singer, but I know people who are. And for them to be able to sing this song, to bring that story back to life again is just an amazing thing.
Thank you so much for doing that. That's great.